In January 1885, a lone British general stood on the steps of a besieged palace in the heart of Africa, waiting for a rescue force that was still 2 days away. And by the time that force finally arrived, the man Britain called its most fearless soldier was already dead, and an empire was left asking how its most celebrated hero had been allowed to die alone. His name was Charles George Gordon, and to understand how a man so respected, so decorated, and so feared by his enemies ended up trapped in a dying city with no way out, we have to go back decades, to a battlefield in the Crimea, and follow the strange, restless path of a soldier who never seemed to want peace, comfort, or safety, even when the empire he served was willing to give it to him. Gordon began his military career in the 1850s as a young officer in the Royal Engineers, serving in the brutal Crimean War against Russia, where he first developed a reputation for cool, almost reckless courage under fire, the kind of composure that made superiors trust him with dangerous assignments and made soldiers under his command believe he was somehow untouchable. But it was not Crimea that made Gordon a legend, it was China. In the 1860s, the Qing dynasty was fighting for its survival against the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil conflicts in human history, a war that would ultimately claim tens of millions of lives. Gordon was placed in command of a Chinese force known as the Ever-Victorious Army, a mixed unit of Chinese soldiers under foreign officers, originally formed to defend Shanghai and other territories from Taiping forces. Under Gordon's leadership, this army won a remarkable string of victories, often through disciplined tactics, careful use of artillery, and Gordon's own habit of walking into danger unarmed except for a small cane, a detail that became part of his legend because it suggested a man who genuinely did not fear death. Chinese officials were so impressed that they awarded him the Yellow Jacket, one of the empire's highest honors, and back home in Britain, newspapers began calling him Chinese Gordon, a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life and mark the beginning of his transformation from a competent officer into a national symbol of Victorian heroism. What made Gordon different from many of his contemporaries was not just his battlefield success, but his personal code. He refused financial rewards that he felt were excessive. He was deeply religious in a personal and somewhat unconventional way, and he seemed genuinely uninterested in wealth or comfort, preferring instead a life of constant motion, difficult postings, and moral causes. This combination of bravery, humility, and religious conviction made him almost impossible for the Victorian public not to admire, and by the 1870s, Gordon was already being written about as a kind of ideal English soldier, a man who fought not for glory but for duty. It was this reputation that eventually drew him to Sudan, a vast and difficult territory in northeastern Africa that was nominally under the control of Egypt, which was itself increasingly influenced by Britain due to Egypt's debts and its strategic importance, particularly after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. In 1873, the Khedive of Egypt appointed Gordon as governor of the Equatoria province in southern Sudan, largely because of his reputation for honesty and effectiveness. And Gordon spent years working to suppress the slave trade in the region, a brutal and deeply entrenched practice that had devastated local populations for generations. In 1877, he was promoted to Governor General of the entire Sudan, a position of enormous responsibility over a territory roughly the size of Western Europe, with limited resources, difficult terrain, and constant political tension between different ethnic and religious groups. Gordon worked tirelessly in this role, but the job took a toll on his health, and in 1880 he resigned and returned to Britain, believing his time in Sudan was finished. He could not have known that Sudan would call him back one final time, under circumstances that would define the rest of his life and eventually end it. While Gordon was away, a new and powerful movement was rising in Sudan, led by a religious leader named Mohammed Ahmad, who in 1881 declared himself the Mahdi, a prophesied redeemer figure in Islamic eschatology sent to purify the faith and lead a holy war against corrupt rulers. This was not simply a religious claim, it was a direct political challenge to Egyptian, and by extension, British influence in the region, and it resonated powerfully with many Sudanese who had suffered under years of heavy taxation, forced labor, and the often exploitative practices of the Egyptian administration. The modest movement grew rapidly, drawing support from tribes across Sudan who saw in it both a spiritual calling and a chance to throw off foreign control. Egyptian forces sent to crush the uprising were repeatedly defeated, most catastrophically in November 1883, when an entire Egyptian army of around 10,000 men, commanded by British officer William Hicks, was destroyed at the Battle of Shaken, a disaster that shocked observers in Cairo and London alike, and made clear that the modest forces were not a minor rebellion, but a serious military and political power capable of controlling most of Sudan. This raised an urgent and uncomfortable question for the British government under Prime Minister William Gladstone, because while Britain did not officially administer Sudan, it effectively controlled Egyptian policy, and thousands of Egyptian soldiers and civilians, along with foreign nationals, were now trapped in Sudanese garrison towns as the modest forces advanced. Gladstone's government, however, was deeply reluctant to commit British troops or resources to what looked like an expensive and open-ended colonial war in a remote part of Africa, especially since public opinion in Britain was divided on the value of further imperial entanglements. Instead of full military intervention, the decision was made to evacuate Egyptian forces and officials from Sudan entirely, essentially abandoning the territory to the modest movement. And to oversee this evacuation, the government needed someone with credibility, local knowledge, and enough personal authority to manage a complicated and dangerous withdrawal. Gordon, still enormously popular with the public and known for his experience in the region, was the obvious choice, and in January 1884 he was sent to Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, with instructions to assess the situation and arrange for the safe evacuation of Egyptian and foreign personnel. It is here that the story takes its fateful turn, because rather than simply organizing a withdrawal, Gordon began to believe that abandoning Khartoum and the surrounding population to modest forces would be both a strategic mistake and a moral failure. Historians have long debated Gordon's exact reasoning during this period, and it is important to be careful here rather than assume we know his private thoughts with certainty. But based on his own writings and telegrams, it appears he became convinced that holding Khartoum was necessary to prevent the total collapse of order in the region, and that abandoning the city would expose thousands of civilians and loyal soldiers to the advancing modest army. Gordon requested reinforcements and additional support from the British government, but Gladstone's cabinet remained hesitant, wary of being drawn deeper into a costly and unpopular conflict. As Gordon's telegrams grew more urgent through the early months of 1884, the political situation in London grew more complicated as well, because public sympathy for Gordon, fueled by newspaper coverage that portrayed him as a lone hero standing against overwhelming odds, began to put enormous pressure on the government to act. Meanwhile, the military situation around Khartoum deteriorated steadily. By March 1884, modest forces had surrounded the city, cutting off river and land routes and beginning what would become a siege lasting nearly a year. Khartoum sat at the strategic junction of the Blue Nile and White Nile, a position that made it valuable but also difficult to defend once cut off, since the rivers that once served as lifelines for supply and communication became avenues that the besieging forces could also control. Inside the city, Gordon organized defenses with the resources available to him, using Egyptian troops, some armed civilians, and whatever fortifications could be built or reinforced, while food supplies steadily dwindled as the months dragged on and no relief force appeared. This is one of the most striking aspects of the siege of Khartoum, the sheer length of time that passed while the British government debated what to do, a delay that would later become one of the most controversial decisions in Victorian political history. It was not until August 1884, 5 months into the siege, that Parliament finally authorized funding for a relief expedition, and preparations for such a mission across hundreds of miles of harsh desert and river terrain took additional months to organize. The relief force, commanded by General Garnet Wolseley, one of the most respected military organizers of the era, faced an extraordinarily difficult logistical challenge, needing to move troops and supplies along the Nile using a combination of river steamers, specially designed boats, and camel-mounted desert columns, through territory that was often hostile, poorly mapped, and subject to the same harsh conditions that had worn down previous expeditions. Wolsey's force made steady but painfully slow progress through late 1884, fighting engagements along the way, including notably difficult battles at Abu Klea and Abu Kru in January 1885, where British troops faced determined modest resistance and suffered significant losses even in victory. Every mile gained came at a cost in time, and time was the one resource Gordon and the defenders of Khartoum did not have. Back in the besieged city, conditions had grown desperate by the final weeks of the siege. Food supplies were nearly exhausted, disease was spreading, and the defensive perimeter, weakened by months of attrition, was becoming harder to hold. On the night of January 25 into the early morning of January 26, 1885, modest forces launched their final assault on Khartoum, breaching the city's defenses and overwhelming the exhausted garrison. The precise details of Gordon's final moments have been the subject of historical debate for well over a century, and rather than presenting any single dramatic account as verified fact, it is more accurate to say that Gordon was killed during the fall of the city, with most historical reconstructions placing his death at or near the governor's palace as modest fighters broke through. Though the exact circumstances remain difficult to establish with complete certainty, given the chaos of the assault and the limited surviving eyewitness accounts, what is certain, and what makes this story such a devastating example of timing and consequence, is that the lead elements of Wolsey's relief expedition arrived at Khartoum only 2 days later, on January 28, 1885, to find the city already fallen and Gordon already dead. The soldiers who had marched and fought for months through desert terrain to save one man arrived just in time to witness the aftermath of a tragedy they could not prevent. When news of Gordon's death reached Britain, the public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers that had spent months building Gordon into a symbol of heroic, self-sacrificing duty now turned that same narrative into a story of national grief and political betrayal. And Gladstone's government faced intense criticism for what many saw as fatal indecision, with critics arguing that earlier and faster action could have saved Gordon's life. The Prime Minister, previously respected for decades of political service, became the target of public anger, and the phrase "too late" became closely associated with the government's handling of the crisis, a phrase that captured both the literal outcome of the relief expedition and the broader sense that political hesitation had cost a national hero his life. It is worth noting here that historians continue to debate how much responsibility rests with Gordon's own decisions, including his choice to remain in Khartoum rather than strictly following his original evacuation orders, versus how much responsibility lies with the slow and cautious response from London, and reasonable historical interpretations differ on how to weigh these factors. Since Gordon's independence and willingness to act on his own judgment were part of what made him effective throughout his career, but also arguably contributed to the situation that ultimately trapped him. In the aftermath of Khartoum's fall, the Mahdist movement, now led by Mohammed Ahmad's successor after the Mahdi's own death later in 1885, established control over most of Sudan, creating an independent Mahdist state that would govern the region for the next 13 years, largely outside of British or Egyptian control. For Britain, Gordon's death became a rallying point that shaped imperial policy in the region for over a decade, and the desire to avenge his death, combined with broader strategic interests in controlling the Nile Valley, eventually led to a renewed British and Egyptian military campaign under General Herbert Kitchener in the late 1890s. This campaign culminated in the Battle of Omdurman in September 1898, where a combined Anglo-Egyptian force decisively defeated Mahdist forces near Khartoum, effectively ending Mahdist rule in Sudan and bringing the territory under British and Egyptian joint administration, a political arrangement that would last until Sudanese independence in 1956. The reconquest of Sudan was framed by many in Britain at the time as a form of justice for Gordon, and Kitchener himself was deeply conscious of this symbolism, reportedly ensuring that Gordon's memory was honored during the campaign. Though again, historians note that strategic and economic motives, particularly concerns about French and other European rivals in the region, played a significant role alongside any sentimental motivations tied to Gordon's death. Gordon himself became one of the most enduring symbols of Victorian heroism, memorialized in statues, paintings, and countless books that portrayed him as a martyr figure. A lone Christian soldier standing firm against overwhelming odds while his own government failed to act in time. This image, while rooted in real events, was also shaped and amplified by the particular values of Victorian Britain, which prized individual duty, religious conviction, and stoic self-sacrifice. And it is worth recognizing that the popular memory of Gordon says as much about how Britain wanted to see itself in that era as it does about the historical man. Modern historians tend to offer a more complicated picture, acknowledging Gordon's genuine courage and administrative skill, while also examining more critically the colonial context in which he operated, the complex political motivations behind Britain's involvement in Sudan, and the human cost borne by Sudanese and Egyptian people caught between competing imperial and religious movements throughout this period. The story of Gordon's death at Khartoum ultimately raises questions that go beyond one man's fate, questions about how governments weigh political caution against moral obligation, about how public opinion and media narratives can shape and sometimes distort historical decision-making, and about the immense difficulty of coordinating military action across vast distances in an age before modern communication and transport. 2 days. That was the gap between rescue and tragedy, between a story of triumphant relief and one of national mourning, and it remains one of history's most striking reminders of how thin the line can be between different outcomes, shaped not by a single dramatic moment, but by months of decisions, delays, and circumstances that slowly closed in around one man in a city surrounded on all sides. Charles Gordon's life took him from the battlefields of Crimea to the war-torn provinces of China, and finally to the banks of the Nile. And in each of these chapters, he built a reputation as a soldier defined by personal courage and an unwavering sense of duty. Yet it was ultimately not an enemy's weapon that ended his story in the way legend often prefers to remember it, but a trap built slowly out of distance, delay, and difficult choices, one that closed just before help could arrive, leaving behind a legacy that Britain would spend more than a decade trying to reconcile.